Welcome back, Philosophy 135. Dr. K here. I hope you all are doing well. In our last video, we looked at Plato's cosmological argument for God. In this video, we're going to look at Maimonides' cosmological argument for God. Now, Maimonides was a medieval Jewish philosopher, and he is thought to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Jewish philosopher. The argument that we're going to look at appears in his most famous work, which is titled The Guide of the Perplexed. Now, I want to say at the outset that Maimonides is a proponent of something that's called negative theology. Now, put simply, negative theology is the position that if you want to make true statements about God, you can't make statements that predicate positive attributes to God. You can only make true statements about God using negative attributes. So in case you're unfamiliar with attributes, attributes are just terms that specify a thing in some way. Big, small, over there, blue, green, pointy, etc. So if I say the grass is green, green is an attribute here because it specifies something. It narrows down the thing by pointing out its color, namely it's green. Now, there are two main kinds of attributes, positive attributes and negative attributes. Positive attributes are terms that specify a thing by indicating or describing some part of the totality of that thing. So if I say the ocean is blue or the ocean is sparkly, blue in the first sentence and sparkly in the second sentence are positive attributes because they specify the ocean by indicating or describing some part of the totality of the ocean. So the ocean is this huge thing with many different features, but at least two of the features which separate it out from some other things is that it is blue and it is sparkly. Negative attributes are terms that specify a thing not by indicating some part of its totality, but by eliminating candidate parts of its totality or possible parts of its totality. So if I was to say the ocean is not pointy or the ocean is not small, then not pointy in the first sentence and not small in the second sentence would be negative attributes because those are terms that specify a thing, namely the ocean, by eliminating candidate features or parts that it might have, but doesn't. So Maimonides thinks that you can't predicate positive attributes to God if you want to make true statements about God. You can only predicate negative attributes about God if you want to make true statements about God. This is for various reasons, including that Maimonides holds predicating positive attributes to God implies that he is compound or has parts, that he is caused or dependent on things outside of himself, and that he is a physical object or a body. And Maimonides rejects each of these things. Whereas predicating negative attributes have none of these consequences or implications, and hence you can make true statements with them about God. So while Maimonides would hold you can't truly say God is all good or God is all knowing or God is all powerful, right? Because those are all positive attributes. But however, you can say things such as God is not evil or God is not weak or God is not stupid, because not evil, not weak, and not stupid are all negative attributes, and negative attributes don't conflict with or are consistent with God being simple or lacking parts, uncaused, and non-physical or incorporeal, as Maimonides thinks that he is. So, of course, there's more to say. I've just given you a little primer on Maimonides' negative theology. And the reason I wanted to do that is because when we look at his argument for the existence of God, you'll see that he's arguing for the existence of a being that he characterizes only in terms of negative attributes. So now that we've had an introduction to Maimonides and we've had an introduction or primer to his negative theology, which is going to be background to his argument for the existence of God and inform and explain the reason that he argues for the existence of God in the way and in the terms that he does. Now let's turn to discussing Maimonides' cosmological argument for the existence of God. So let's start with a summary or overview of how the argument is going to go before we get into the details. So the argument has four main parts. In the first part, Maimonides is going to argue for the existence of an ungenerated and imperishable being. In the second part, he's going to argue that this imperishable, ungenerated being is non-compound, or has no parts, or is simple. In the third part, he's going to argue that this ungenerated, imperishable, non-compound being is not physical, or is not a body, right? It's not spatially extended. And in the fourth part, he's going to conclude from the existence of a ungenerated, imperishable, non-compound, non-bodily being that God exists, because he's going to identify that being with God. So now let's look in some detail at the first part of his argument for the existence of God, which is his argument for the existence of an ungenerated and imperishable being. Okay, here's the first part of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God. Again, it's going to be an argument for an ungenerated and imperishable being. Premise 1 starts off very simply. Some things exist. For example, we exist, right? And we observe that other things exist. So there are existing things. Premise 2, either A, nothing that exists is subject to generation and corruption, right? Nothing that exists is subject to coming into being and passing out of being. Or B, everything that exists is subject to generation and corruption. Or C, some things are and some are not. Premise 3, possibility A is absurd, for we constantly observe things coming into being and ceasing to be. 4, but possibility B is absurd too, for if nothing were permanent, then everything could cease to exist and nothing take its place. But the possibility or idea or actuality of an empty universe is absurd. Thus, in 5, by elimination, C has to be the case. That's to say, some things come into being and perish, but there must also exist some being that does not. 6, which is the conclusion, therefore, there must exist a being that is ungenerated and imperishable, and we could also call such a being an eternal being if what we meant by it was an ungenerated and imperishable being. So that was part 1 of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God. Now let's have a look at part 2. So part 2 of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God, and this is going to be an argument that the ungenerated and imperishable being he proved to exist in part 1 is a being that is itself without parts, or is non-compound, or is simple. So premise 6. This is the conclusion of part 1 of the argument. There must exist a being that is ungenerated and imperishable. 7, whatever is ungenerated is uncaused. That's to say, it depends on nothing outside of itself for its existence. 8, but everything with parts is caused. That's to say, it depends upon its parts for its existence, and the parts are not identical to it. So, for example, consider a sandcastle. A sandcastle is a compound object made of individual parts, namely grains of sand. None of those grains of sand is identical to the castle itself. And if those grains of sand cease to exist, then the sandcastle ceases to exist. Let that sandcastle represent any type of compound object. Such objects depend upon their parts for their existence, and none of the parts are identical to the compound object itself. 9, and again, this is going to be a derivation from 6 through 8. Therefore, there must exist a being that is ungenerated and imperishable, and also without parts. All right, so that was part 2 of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God. Now let's have a look at part 3. So in part 3 of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God, he's going to argue that the ungenerated, imperishable, and partless or simple being that he argued for in parts 1 and 2 is also incorporeal or non-physical. Premise 9, and remember this was the conclusion of the argument from part 2. Thus, there must exist a being that is ungenerated and imperishable and without parts or simple. 10. But every bodily or physical thing has parts. And you might say, well, isn't there some smallest bit or part of matter that exists but has no parts? And Maimonides wouldn't think so. He'd think that anything that is extended could in principle be divided infinitely. And further, think about discoveries in particle physics. If you look at the history of particle physics, at different times they thought they've found the smallest particle, and then they find that there's parts to that particle, and so on and so on. Every few years a new and even smaller particle is found. Right? So look, if there's got to exist a being that's ungenerated and imperishable and doesn't have parts, but every bodily thing has parts, then it follows in 11 that there must exist a being that's ungenerated, imperishable, without parts, and thus, which is also non-bodily or incorporeal. Okay, so that was part 3 of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God, and I said it was a 4-part argument. So now let's look at part 4, which is the concluding part of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God. So part 4 of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God, namely, this is going to be the argument where he concludes that God exists, and he's going to do that by identifying God with the being that's ungenerated, imperishable, without parts, and incorporeal. So 11, which again was the conclusion from part 3, there must exist a being that is ungenerated, imperishable, without parts, and incorporeal or non-physical. 12, God equals a being that is ungenerated, imperishable, without parts, and incorporeal. 13, thus God exists. Okay, so that was Maimonides' argument for the existence of God. And I encourage you to go back and look at the slides, which constitute the 4 parts of the argument. Read through them yourself. Think about them. Go back in your book and read the text where he expresses the argument. And think about the argument yourself. Are you convinced by it? Why or why not? One question you might have is whether proving the existence of a being that is ungenerated, imperishable, without parts, and non-bodily is sufficient to prove that God exists. Or might you have to prove also, for example, that that being that's ungenerated, imperishable, without parts, and non-bodily also is the creator of the world, right? So think about the questions you have. If you have any thoughts on this and you want to share, I'd love to see it in the comments below. In the next video, we're going to look at Al-Ghazali's argument from design for the existence of God. Before we go, I want to say a few things about Maimonides' argument for the existence of God. The first is, notice how Maimonides took God's incorporeality to follow from his being without parts, and he took his being without parts to follow from or come out of his being ungenerated and imperishable. So notice that the negative attributes of being ungenerated and imperishable are foundational to God possessing the other negative attributes that Maimonides takes him to have, namely of being partless or simple and of being incorporeal or without a body, non-bodily. The second thing that I want to say is notice that in making his argument, Maimonides was consistent in not predicating any type of positive attributes to God, which he had earlier excluded. Notice the claims that he makes about God are that God is not generated, he cannot perish, he does not have parts, and he is not bodily or is not a physical object. So his characterization of God in the argument is completely negative. It's composed of negative attributes. So again, my point here is that in arguing for God, he doesn't say anything that is inconsistent with what he had earlier argued about most positive predicates being inapplicable to God. Well, all right, of course, there's more to say. We can go on. But for now, that's going to conclude our discussion of Maimonides' argument for the existence of God. I'll see you in the next video. Dr. K out.